Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of Shadow and Sun. Tonight I'm going to go over the 7 major breakthroughs I've had while painting the Dungeons & Lasers Legacy Kickstarter edition. Hopefully these tips will help you guys out. Hopefully you're not done painting all your Kickstarter pieces. Even if so, hopefully these tips will help you out in the future. The first one, I don't know if you guys caught our The Druid Was Right video. You may have noticed that when I primered those pieces, they came out rather fuzzy, and that was because either the can was over a year old or because of the extreme heat we were going through at the time. Either way, my number one tip is to take a Sharpie and write down the date you purchased the can so that later on when you go to use the can, you'll know roughly how old it is. And if it's a year old, I'd recommend tossing the can and getting another one.
Also, this has nothing to do with it, but there are some of the crafts paint that we have, specifically the neon orange, which has this weird effect where it has a yellow in it, which makes it really good for painting fire. I recently did something with it, and it turned out good. I didn't have to use any yellow for it. The neon orange just kind of had yellow in it, which was weird.
Yeah, sometimes liquid paints will separate, and sometimes you can actually get an interesting effect. Good point. My number 2 tip is, yes, you could use the cheapy paints. In our dry brushing episode of Dungeons & Lasers, we used this exact type of gray paint to paint the dungeon walls, and it works out just fine.
Also, it might be better because the crafts paint is cheaper, so if you're painting a really big project like
the Dungeons &
Lasers stuff, it's best to use something that you can get a lot of, especially because most of the crafts paints turn out pretty good. I mean, you most likely don't want to use this type of paint on like a really good quality miniature, but it's probably best to use it on scenery.
Yeah. You can definitely use this. A lot of people use this mostly on, like you said, terrain and scenery. You can actually use it on miniatures. I did when I was first painting. That's all I knew about. That's all there was. I didn't know about Citadel paints, and this was 40 years ago. But you can still use this for a lot of things, so don't discount it. You can also actually use inks.
Is this your third point?
No, this is still number 2. You can use inks to some effect, and because of the availability, especially now with all the craft stores and hobby stores closed or completely out of stock of products, you might have to improvise. So yes, you can use cheap paints and inks. Another thing you probably also saw during our dry brushing episode.
Is this all the same point?
This is point number 3. Makeup brushes. When you're doing terrain, especially large pieces or large projects like the Dungeons & Lasers, a cheap makeup brush from the 99-cent store or your dollar store, whatever you have in your local area, a dry brush paint brush specifically made for dry brushing will take you years to get through a project like this. You can get a multi-pack of different sized.
Oh.
You can get a multi-pack of different sized makeup brushes for really cheap. They work really good, and they actually last quite a while. This brush I used through the entire dungeon Kickstarter parts that we got, and I'm still using it on other things. Tip number 4, the wet palette. In this heat, I discovered that a wet palette can be made with your good old-fashioned Rubbermaid container, some baking parchment paper. Underneath, I have 2 wet paper towels, and this paint, as you can see, I put in here Sunday night, and it's still wet. I can still use it, and instead of spending $10-15 on a wet palette, boom, for about $1.
You should probably test later how long it lasts. But
I am in the process of continually testing it. These paints are actually not something I'm using. I'm just testing to see how long they stay wet and how long I can still use them for. If you do not have one of these containers, or you can't get the baking parchment paper, you can make a temporary wet palette by using your good old-fashioned Pringles lid. Take a couple of paper towels, fold them up, get them wet, drop your paint on there, and especially if you're dealing with, extreme heat or humidity or conditions that will dry up your paint, wet the paper towel, put your paint down on the paper towel, and when you're done, you just toss the paper towel. Number 5, dry brushing without
Wasting paint.
Without wasting paint and without using a ton of paper towels. Paper towels have also been kind of hard for us to find, or napkins. I'm going to show you a little trick here.
Yeah, I also tested this in the same project. It actually worked really well.
So instead of...
I didn't waste any, well, other than the red.
Normally this is how most people will dry brush. They'll get their paint and then they will do this. Okay? Now it may not seem like a lot, and then you're ready to dry brush. But what I've found is instead of doing what I just did, I will take the brush and then I will wipe the paint on the lip or edge of the Pringles lid or coffee can lid, whatever you got.
Lids that are similar shaped.
This is something that you would normally throw away. Now you can see all that paint that I've scraped off, okay, onto the lid. I will end up using all this paint. I will never use that paint. And now, look at that. That's what you want your brush to look like, or the paper to look like, when you're ready to dry brush, as opposed to that. Mm-hmm. That's a bunch of wasted paint. That is what you want your brush. That's how much paint you want left on your brush when you're going to dry brush. And you saved that much paint. And trust me, when you can't find paint, it adds up. If you can't find paper towels, it adds up. Also, I will reuse this paper towel when it dries. I'll wait till it dries and then I will reuse it. I will wash this after the video, don't worry guys. Tip number 6. This is a little bit longer tip. Flow aid. When your paints start getting dry, or they're just too thick, or they're not performing like they used to, maybe 1 or 2 drops of Flow Aid in your bottle, shake it back up, your paints will come back to life a little bit.
Are you sure about that?
Yeah, I'm sure about that. Now, another thing I discovered when it comes to...
Is this another point?
Dish soap. Dish soap could be used the same way, however...
A bit differently.
This is a wash created from a pint of water, approximately 70 drops of Black India ink, and approximately 10 drops of normal old-fashioned dish soap. Now I want to show you a little trick that's made my life a lot easier when it comes to painting some of these Dungeons and Lasers pieces. This, I believe, is a piece from the AI Center.
In fact, it is. I'm pretty sure this is the only
We
stuff.
spray painted a large portion of the AI Center.
Didn't we spray paint the entire AI Center silver?
Yeah, actually we did the whole AI Center. Now,
So you're good.
watch this little stuff go to work. I'm not even looking at what I'm doing. Barely. Normally I would wear my glasses. But that liquid is just magically going in there. It does not want to hit the raised areas. It wants to find those little nooks and crannies and just jump in there and do its trick, which is to help you wash or ink those crevices with almost no effort at all. Watch these lines. It does not want to touch the raised areas.
Obviously, sometimes it will.
And even then when it does, you use your brush and it will act like a sponge and go right back in to the crevices.
With bigger areas, it often actually does have a small issue, but that is easily fixed.
Yeah, sometimes in a larger area you will
like
have to...
those pipe things.
You
I've
will
noticed
have
that
to.
they don't look as good.
You might actually have to make a second coat when it dries, but otherwise this stuff is just the silver bullet, the magic weapon when you really want to get these areas done fast. I will put the recipe again in the description of the video. And the final tip I have for you guys, I've mentioned this before on the Kickstarter comments page, but that is homemade contrast paint. I painted this part of the Xenogenesis with a homemade contrast paint. One pass, and it looks really good. I'm not done painting this. It's just a little sneak preview, guys.
Also, are you going to say where you found it?
Yes, I actually found this recipe on Goobertowns' video on contrast paints. It's more or less his recipe with a slight modification.
What is that modification?
A little bit more of the flow aid. The recipe is 2 milliliters of matte medium, which I get from Liquitex.
You should probably show that.
Can you see it?
Yeah.
Then 2 milliliters of whatever ink you want, whatever color you want to use.
India ink, I assume.
Right. Any ink will work, actually. You can experiment with colors and brands. I picked what they had. Then 6 to 10 drops of flow aid. Depends on what kind of consistency you want and how much you want it to flow into the cracks as opposed to stay up on the surfaces. A lot of companies have come out with contrast paints that are very expensive, and I'm not a big fan of spending a lot of money on supplies as opposed to what I'm going to paint. I'd rather spend my money on miniatures or scenery pieces than $10 on a bottle of paint. This will make literally dozens of bottles of contrast paint for, I don't even know how much cheaper it is, but I know it's a lot cheaper. I'll probably figure that out when I'm done using up an entire bottle of the green ink. That way I'll have a better idea of how much cheaper it is. But those are my 7 biggest tips, biggest things I've learned in the last 3 months of working on the Dungeons & Lasers product. And I hope they help you guys out. Hope you guys will leave a like and subscribe if you're not already subscribed. And I hope you guys will join us in our next video Thursday night. Until then, have a great evening.